the stars are very aligned, right? In a lot of ways, to not only like see all of the hype and like the real things that are happening in manufacturing going on right now, but to actually incentivize people to move back into this field. And, one company is great, but we need more. And so I'm hoping as more entrepreneurs and founders jump into the fight, there's so many problems to solve, honestly. I don't want to say that startup companies are kind of like, the last bastion of hope, but I think that they can be the vanguard for it.
Let's discover what people are building in the greater Cleveland community. We are telling the stories of Northeast Ohio's entrepreneurs, builders, and those supporting them. Welcome to the Lay of the Land podcast, where we are exploring what people are building in Cleveland and throughout Northeast Ohio. I am your host, Jeffrey Stern, and today I had the real privilege of speaking with my friend Aaron Slodov. Aaron studied physics in college, pursued a PhD in power systems engineering where he focused on electrical grid infrastructure and energy storage systems, had a stint at Google as an operations engineer, and then went on in 2014 to co-found Remesh, an AI market research startup, which has gone on to raise over $40 million in funding. Today, Aaron is the CEO of Atomic Industries, a company which he founded back in 2019 and has raised over $20 million for. Atomic is on a mission to exascale the American manufacturing sector, starting with the focus to make tool and die making orders of magnitude easier and faster through advanced automation. Through the lens of Aaron's underlying techno-industrialist philosophy, we will unpack what exascaling our industrial base even means, confronting the post-industrial myth and rich history of manufacturing in Ohio and throughout the Midwest, the opportunity for technology and implications of automation in building physical things, why more young, smart, ambitious people should consider careers in manufacturing and heavy industry relative to software as a service companies, the pursuit of Monozukuri, Atomic Industries' role to play in all of this, and a whole lot more. You can find a link to Aaron's Techno-Industrialist manifesto, which he published in February of 2024 and which has gone viral in pockets of the internet, in the show notes to this episode. This was truly one of my favorite conversations on the podcast so far. Aaron's passion for applying technology to solve big picture social and scientific problems, and his ambition in building companies to that end, is genuinely inspiring. So with that, please enjoy my conversation with Aaron Slodov after a brief message from our sponsors. As a disclaimer to this episode, I am personally a small investor in Atomic Industries. Lay of the Land is brought to you by John Carroll University's Boler College of Business, widely recognized as one of the top business schools in the region. As we've heard time and time again from entrepreneurs here on Lay of the Land, many of whom are proud alumni of John Carroll University, success in this ever-changing world of business requires a dynamic and innovative mindset, deep understanding of emerging technologies and systems, strong ethics, leadership prowess, acute business acumen, all qualities nurtured through the Boler College of Business. With 4 different MBA programs of study spanning professional, online, hybrid, and 1-year flexible, the Boler College of Business provides flexible timelines and various class structures for each MBA track, including online, in-person, hybrid, and asynchronous, all to offer the most effective options for you, including the ability to participate in an elective international study tour, providing unparalleled opportunities to expand your global business knowledge by networking with local companies overseas and experiencing a new culture. The career impact of a Boler MBA is formative and will help prepare you for this future of business and get more out of your career. To learn more about John Carroll University's Boler MBA programs, please go to business.jcu.edu. The Boler College of Business is fully accredited by AACSB International, the highest accreditation a college of business can have. So this may be the longest Slave Land podcast episode in the making. Probably over 3 years, but I think conversation well worth the wait.
We've done it.
So thank you for joining us here, Aaron.
Absolutely.
I think this is going to be a lot of fun. So I want to dive right into the heart of what you're working on, thinking on, and talking about most recently, which is techno-industrialism. this kind of powerful collision between technology and manufacturing to set, I think, the grand stage for a lot of what we'll unpack today with the work you're doing with atomic industries. And again, just thinking about more broadly, waging this war against stagnation in the world of atoms. So I'd love if at the highest level, you could just tell us what that is. What is techno-industrialism?
So my definition of this is basically, how are we transforming two classically very distant fields, right? Technology and manufacturing are very much an oil and water kind of scenario.
Yeah.
This is a function of multiple things. I think you have crazy adoption curves because of, shifting demographics with people in heavy industry and manufacturing. The challenge that's also presented plainly is just that manufacturing is very challenging to do, right?
Yeah.
Many of the manufacturing processes that exist are not just something you can transform overnight. And they're also super capital intensive, and a lot of the tribal knowledge around, these different areas requires an immense amount of transfer to go from like one generation to another. So there's a lot of barriers, a lot of friction to do something like this. So yeah, I mean, building up capacity and tribal knowledge in these areas, right? Like merging technology with industry is something that I think we'll see a lot more of. But that's kind of like where my definition rests. I have a lot more I can go into on that. But,
and when we'll get there, we'll unpack, I think, the entirety of the manifesto as you put it down into words and galvanized for all of us to look at. But I thought a fun way to explore, your own inspiration for it and some of the work you're doing with atomic industries would be to unpack your call to arms, if you will, kind of applied to yourself, because you had this impassioned part of your manifesto that was urging top technical talent, to leave lucrative and prestigious jobs in the technological world, which has afforded them, a lot of real capital, social capital to take up, these entrepreneurial arms to combat the hard industrial challenges that you've begun to introduce here. But I'd love to hear how you heed your own counsel, in that regard, as you ultimately made that same shift.
Yeah, I think the genesis for me really has been a very long path, right? I've always been pretty enamored with moonshot type thinking, in a lot of ways. And I guess I've never been super afraid to really get my hands dirty. And I've always loved to build things, but taking that to heart, going from working on kind of like physics in my undergrad and then shifting from that to going to Silicon Valley and like working, at a FANG company, and then getting exposure to real world projects like working in renewable energy and self-driving cars and software, and seeing the spectrum of like how all these things kind of, would play out in my mind and also in real life. And yeah, the world of atoms is always a longer, more arduous path. And maybe I'm just, a total masochist. I don't know. But there's something more interesting, inherently, right? Because I genuinely think when I'm on my deathbed, do I want to imagine having worked on like a SaaS product, or do I want to try to build and engineer something that literally pushes humanity further and forward, right? And I think you need that type of insanity to really dedicate yourself to something in this field, because it's really challenging, right? And it's not something that has the easiest and most apparent returns. So for me, I think, going through that whole process and then ultimately like starting Remesh, right? And going through the journey of building a SaaS company, right? It was fascinating. And ultimately, I just keep coming back to stuff like this. So I don't know. I think I'm probably ultimately just more attracted to doing things in the physical world.
What drew you to entrepreneurship in the first place?
I think in a lot of ways, I believe in, the agency that these types of endeavors grant you. And I know that that's not, a possible thing for a lot of people just trying to survive. That was me though, at some point, right? Like I genuinely don't think that the opportunities out there are just like calling at people. You really have to just like forge it yourself. And I'm pretty hard-headed about that in a lot of ways. And so a lot of times I would just suffer, right? And like probably needlessly. And I made my way through somehow. I think it's just kind of on each individual, There's no, I don't think there's like a grand framework for this stuff.
Yeah.
And I do genuinely think though that like, if you go through the gauntlet, basically, you can come out on top. It might take, 10 or 15 years to do it. And you might be struggling the whole time. But, ultimately, it's cool that we have, willpower and we can do this stuff ourselves. I don't know. It could sound like a really entitled thing to say stuff like that, because I just like, listen to myself say it. And then I actually think about how I didn't have help from, right, like my parents genuinely. And like I worked my ass off working like 2 jobs during school and like paid for it. And it took me like 6 years to get through undergrad, just because I was working so much to support myself. And I chose, really strange things to study in undergrad, and ultimately, took these jobs that brought me in different directions. I don't know. It's like, it's really fascinating. But yeah, for me, I think entrepreneurship is like a form of freedom in some way. You just really have to like put your head down.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Well, if you'll indulge the Remesh detour for a moment, what was the catalyst that drew you to wanting to pursue something at first in the world of bits?
Yeah, so the kind of like moonshot thinking around Remesh was, we genuinely thought that we had come up with a new novel way to communicate and like facilitate communication with people.
Yeah.
Which I still think, right? Like there's no social platform on the planet that allows you to have a conversation with thousands of people on the other side of it. And it's like a fluid dialogue, right? I still think that's really novel and interesting. And I wanted to see that and push it to some like grand scale. Like one of our fantasies was always just, like having the president speak to 100,000 Americans and just have like an open dialogue. I mean,
AMA.
Right. But it would be this real fluid dialogue where 100,000 people could respond instantaneously to a question that the president asks. Like, it's kind of crazy. And I genuinely still believed in that. And that's why I went into working on Remesh, because I thought that we could push that into the world. And yeah, I mean, it's still, using Twitter as much as I do now today. I genuinely think there's still like a huge opportunity for something like Remesh. There's a lot of noise in the world, for sure.
Yeah. So when you reflect on that, knowing the work you're doing now, was there a particular moment that opened your eyes to or catalyzed this desire to shift your focus to working in the world of atoms over bits? Or was it really this, end of life, regret aversion framework that, what inspired that?
Well, there's a really specific story that kind of led me to this. But yeah, after I stepped away from Remesh, I picked up a couple side projects.
Yeah.
While I was trying to just reset.
Mm-hmm.
And one of these was making a consumer product. And it was something that I had to get manufactured.
Yeah.
So I think the interesting part about this was I genuinely didn't have any exposure to manufacturing up to this point. So I had asked some of my friends that still worked on hardware teams, at big tech companies and just out in the world. And a lot of them told me, you need to go find a supplier to make this thing that you want to do.
Yep.
And I was like, okay, like what the hell is that? And they're like, go on Alibaba and look for, like a factory in China and send them the designs for your stuff and they'll turn it around. Or go to some American suppliers and they'll charge you like 5 times the price and it'll take longer. So this whole thing was really fascinating because what I was trying to make were toys, basically.
Right.
These were like little figurines for Warhammer and D&D. I didn't think this was a big deal.
Right.
They're stupid little figurines. I mean, it's a hobbyist item, so people expect them to be like high quality. They get really into it. But the way I wanted to manufacture them too, right? Like I wanted to turn more product more quickly than most of the legacy companies were doing. And I thought that was something that, like, why are people not doing this?
Right. Why not?
And I wasn't trying to make a venture company out of it. I was just trying to have fun and make some stupid consumer thing. And yeah, it made me want to like jump off a bridge. It was just crazy, like how much effort really had to go into, designing the product and then taking that design and translating it into something in my hand. So going through all of that, I kind of just stepped back after a while and, I tried conventional manufacturing and working with some of these suppliers. And then I was like, maybe I'll just do it myself. Tried some 3D printing and that sucked. But ultimately, yeah, I just imagined that if I'm having this many problems as like a nobody trying to manufacture like a stupid toy, I can't even imagine how this extrapolates to like global scale manufacturing. It must be orders of magnitude more frustrating, painful, challenging. And it is. I mean, they obviously have much more process wrapped around it and it's very dialed in, but it's still something that's like extremely challenging and painful for everybody.
Right. And is that line of questioning how you essentially kind of amplify the scope and ambition of what you're doing from, as you put it, kind of a toy and consumer goods to there's an opportunity to reindustrialize the American manufacturing base? Like how does that shift come in?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this is going back to that oil and water analogy.
Yeah.
Right. Like you really have to look at individual manufacturing processes and kind of like rip them apart and rebuild them in more efficient ways with more technology, basically. And I genuinely do think that, Tesla is a great example of this. And it's not just like Tesla's the only people in the world doing this, but they're very forward thinking in how they do it.
Yeah.
And it's also really challenging for a lot of existing, well-established mega companies that do manufacture things to like transform their production lines. It's not just this snap of a fingers. So I think looking at that kind of model where we really take the time to scrutinize different manufacturing processes, like especially ones that, hundreds of billions of dollars of goods go through to come into existence, are worth looking at and potentially worth, optimizing in a way where you can build a scalable company around that. And I think that you'll see more and more of this stuff as a function of the technology that exists today. And that's kind of where the idea came from in the first place, right? Like machine learning, robotics, different kinds of autonomy, material science, right? Like there's, a primordial soup of good things happening across the board that might actually make this job easier.
Right.
And so taking that kind of like last mover advantage type of mentality and applying it now, there's just so much opportunity because the markets are absolutely enormous and people are changing a lot of their attitudes about how technology can really impact this stuff. Some of that is a function of just witnessing more and more technology in the world. And some of it's also pressure from like a macro standpoint, right? Like a lot of companies are being forced to adopt and transform how they manufacture in today's, environment. So there's a lot of really interesting tailwinds, I think.
Yeah. And I definitely want to touch on some of those, but I think now might be as good as any place to introduce Atomic Industries. What is it? And what are you working on there?
So, yeah, going back to the story of the figurines, basically what I learned through that was, to make these things, I needed to get a mold.
Yeah.
Right. Like
what is a mold exactly?
I mean, you have like a part that you want to manufacture, right? If you look around on your desk, a lot of this stuff is probably made in molds, but you need a reliable, consistent way to make a single part over and over again.
Yeah.
And there are different manufacturing processes to do that with different types of material, right? So with metal, you might stamp something, or you might machine it or cast it. With plastics, there's molding, right? You shoot liquid hot plastic into a metal cavity and put a lot of pressure on it, and it forms your part, and you open up the mold and pop out your part, right? Like there are all kinds of fundamental ways of making individual part geometries. And so the mastery around each of these different areas varies. And, there's basically like a translation layer where you go from a design to making this mold for that part. And it's fascinating. I mean, this is the kind of mysticism, right, around these trades, because this is not something that you go to school for. It's not an engineering field. You sit in a factory for 2 decades, right, and learn how to solve these problems over and over and over again.
And to your point, I think to most of us, it's entirely obfuscated. Like, I don't know who on average has exposure to the manufacturing process. You just get the product.
Yeah, genuinely, like if you were somebody like me, you might be a little bit more connected to it because you have to go through all the pain, right? Of presenting somebody your design, and then they're going to scrutinize your design for manufacturability. They have to tell you, right? Like, this angle is not good, right? Like, I can't use that in a mold, or this feature that you have here is actually just not manufacturable. So you have to scrutinize the design first before you even design the mold to make that thing. So there's this whole process of tying like end-to-end knowledge, right? From like how you design the tool, how you machine it, and then put it together, and how it works in a factory to pump out your thing. So the best humans that know how to do this stuff have that kind of end-to-end knowledge, and they can just, without any software or simulation tools, they can just look at your design and, they have a vague idea of how challenging it's going to be and how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take. This is an analog to searching through in their brain, right? Like an open solution space for that target.
Yeah.
It's basically like, I can kind of string it together. My brain is not, like a end-to-end physics simulator or anything. I mean, like it kind of is. We kind of have them in our brains just loose, but their job is to do this like mystical translation job. So we think that we can actually teach machines how to do that faster. Or at least once we teach a machine how to do it, we will be able to search through that space much faster. Yeah. And that's kind of the premise of what Atomic is basically, we respect and appreciate, the art and mysticism around a lot of these different fields. We just want to make the process more efficient, right? I don't think many people in this field, which is called tool and die making, would sit there and genuinely tell you with a straight face that they enjoy a lot of the, like arduous, repeatable tasks that they have to do in the design process. There's, if we leave the highest creativity pieces and functions, right, to humans, that's okay. Because even taking away 90% of the low-hanging fruit would be enormous for what they do.
Right. And which is what we've always done with technology.
Exactly. We're not trying to build a faster horse.
Right. So, okay, a lot of directions we could go from here. Let's layer on, I think, some of the headwinds, tailwinds context, I think that, a lot of which you lay out in the manifesto itself, but I think will add to, the color of Atomic's story here. One of the things is, I think we could just actually layer in Ohio for a moment, because, knowing here we have this incredible history right after the Civil War, you begin to see Ohio emerge, particularly around Akron, Cleveland, as arguably one of the greatest, industrial hubs, accounting for, I think, about half the world's rubber production. And then over the subsequent, decades through World War II, layering in oil, iron, steel. And then on top of that, the manufacturing layer and competency over that raw material base. This place became, a formidable production unit with the end-to-end knowledge that, you mentioned earlier. But obviously things have changed. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, layering in your own historical context, but this idea of the post-industrial myth and what that is and how you've thought about it.
Yeah. I mean, at the very highest level, I mean, you can you see a lot of evidence for it today in the news, right? And COVID highlighted a lot of this, where the supply chain sensitivities that we experienced and are currently experiencing were almost a direct result of that, right? Like, if you outsource enough of a skill set like that, it becomes less incentivized over time, and people obviously won't go into it, and that transfer of knowledge fails to continue.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly detrimental, right? Because the trade knowledge is basically all that matters ultimately. So yeah, I think you really see some of this stuff appearing in the news today, right? And I talk about this with building submarines and artillery and semiconductors.
Yeah.
It's crazy, right? Like, there's a whole litany of things that we just literally don't know how to make anymore. And that's happening with the tacit trade knowledge around manufacturing processes as well. So the more pronounced that becomes over time, there's naturally going to be, there's going to be a reaction to that, which is either going to come by way of trying to re-incentivize some of these trade skills very quickly, right?
Right.
And we're seeing that in semiconductors right now. So they build these giant fabs, right, in Columbus and in Arizona, and we don't have enough workers to work in them or even build the fab in the first place. They were trying to bring in Taiwanese people, right, to build the fabs in Arizona, and they got banned. So we're trying to green light them and get them in to help build those things. But even Intel right now has a 1-year training program basically for technicians to work in their fab, to just blast people through really quickly.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating, because when you think about how much time it takes to accumulate and build up trade knowledge, and we're kind of at a global minima almost in a lot of ways, because we've hollowed out so many of these different, areas of trade skill. So yeah, losing and forgetting how to make things and actually how to build things it's terrible, because we ultimately need physical products, right? We are an industrial society, and we can't escape that. That's the whole idea, is you can't just not, pay attention to these types of things. And that also speaks to just where all the incentives ultimately went, right? Yeah, getting a software engineering job at Netflix used to be great, at least, right?
Right. Where are the smartest young people going to work?
Yeah. It's challenging, because you have technology drawing people to these very shiny things, right? And the compensation is obviously amazing. And same thing in finance, right? Are these things a net positive for society in the face of, right, this diminishing kind of stagnation in the physical world? And so this is something that a lot of people have obviously argued for a long time.
Yeah.
But eventually it's really going to be painful. So I think I obviously am biased about this, right? But I want that to go more full into swing right now, because these problems fundamentally are much more challenging than things in computer science and finance, right? They're not highly incentivized today, but we can make them something like that, right? And I think, yeah, in a fundamental way, having a common enemy to unite against, right, is this theme that's easy to galvanize people around. And so if that stagnation is something that we can actually rally around, right, and fight against, I think that we can create the kinds of incentives that draw people like that in. I mean, on a very small scale, I have a pretty crazy amount of people that apply to our company, right? That come from all kinds of amazing areas in technology. And they're fascinated with these problems because they're so hard.
Well, and part of it, I think, is that, but I think you've also been able to articulate what this common enemy is in kind of a succinct, clear, thoughtful way at the same time. It's like a beacon for people who are, wanting to perhaps work on something that they think matters like this, but don't maybe know what the options are.
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. And I think a good amount of people have an innate, desire almost to want to build something with their hands, right? It's just not every day you get a chance to really merge both of these fields together. So I think that's why it's kind of a really interesting, unique time.
Lay of the Land is brought to you by Impact Architects and by 90. As we share the stories of entrepreneurs building incredible organizations in Cleveland and throughout Northeast Ohio, Impact Architects has helped hundreds of those leaders, many of whom we have heard from as guests on this very podcast, realize their own visions and build these great organizations. I believe in Impact Architects and the people behind it so much that I have actually joined them personally in their mission to help leaders gain focus, align together, and thrive by doing what they love. If you too are trying to build great, Impact Architects is offering to sit down with you for a free consultation or provide a free trial through 90, the software platform that helps teams build great companies. If you're interested in learning more about partnering with Impact Architects or by leveraging 90 to power your own business, please go to ia.layoftheland.fm. The link will also be in our show notes. So what is Atomic's role to play in this techno reindustrialization? And I'd love to also just introduce another terminology here that you can layer on, which is exascaling.
Yeah, so the idea of exascaling is something I stole from computing, basically, right? It's a measure of how many basically like operations per unit of time you can get away with ultimately.
Yeah.
In like supercomputing, right? So I kind of think about the industrial base as a giant supercomputer or like AWS, basically. I just kind of imagine it as this obfuscated layer
yeah,
where we need to make a submarine or, 10,000 drones or something. We should be able to do that in a pretty flexible, adaptive way from the raw materials all the way through the manufacturing process and then obviously like distribution. But I think exascaling the industrial base in my brain is kind of how I laid it out in this, manifesto where you've got these different layers of all the applications. And these are things that you want to make.
Yeah.
And then the middle is this layer of execution, which is like the raw trade skill and knowledge of like how. And then the bottom layer is like the capacity. So these are the, machines and the factories and the raw materials that you need to go through that stack and actually perform, the miracle of production. So in a lot of ways, there's no shortage of applications, right? Like we can all come up with really cool stuff.
Yeah.
But we still need to improve the other layers, right? Like execution and capacity. If you can't scale those along with your application layer, you're kind of just where we are right now, like treading water, basically.
Yeah.
And I think that when you look at any manufacturing process that leads from the kind of ground level up in terms of throughput, right? Like I want to produce more submarines. What do you like? Take apart that entire supply chain, right? And understand what it would take to actually make more than 4 submarines per year, which is basically what we can make. Where, there are probably hundreds or thousands of different suppliers attached, right, to like make all the different componentry, not to mention like the design and simulation that goes into those things too. But it's crazy because if you silo them all into different buckets, like they can all be optimized in some way.
Right.
And this is this is what happened in World War II as well, right? Like obviously things were more simple in terms of like their bill of materials, right? Like a Columbia class submarine has 2.5 million components and it takes 14 years to design. I don't think that ships during the World War II era were at that level of complexity. So you've got this kind of function of complexity as things increase over time. Is that actually matching, the manufacturing process on the other end of it? And we really only have like 2 companies that can make submarines now. But again, going back to your question, I think the way that we see ourselves positioned in this and like what exascaling really means is taking a tech-enabled approach, right, to improving and optimizing the foundational layer of manufacturing processes that are required to make all this stuff.
Yeah.
So am I just like a glorified part maker, or can we actually apply these kinds of techniques to other manufacturing processes as well? That's kind of a question that's, TBD over the next 5 to 20 years, basically. But I think that it's something that we can measure, which is why I like the idea of exascaling. I mean, capacity and throughput of the industrial base is something that's measured by economists in general. I just think that we can probably do a better job at pushing it. So, yeah.
So if today we're, treading water, as you say, and what needs to happen for exascaling to come to fruition, and what specifically is Atomic Industries working on in pursuit of that?
So I'm going to answer the second part first. So for tool and die making, right? Like this is a pretty classic problem in production. You want to make a new car model or, a new toothbrush or deodorant, whatever it is.
Yeah.
You ultimately, like the product development lifecycle goes from market research all the way down through, the physical design of the components to ultimately hitting the manufacturing, where you have to go through the same process, right? Where you like study the feasibility of the design itself for the manufacturing process. And then you sign off on that, start designing like the tooling for these different parts. And then they go into production ultimately. And then, if you're a car, you have to obviously assemble all of these parts together into your final vehicle. If it's a deodorant, you still have to kind of assemble that too.
Yep.
You make the plastic container and then you shoot the goo into it and it becomes deodorant, toothpaste, whatever. It's all, everything is really fascinating when you kind of look at it in that light. So for us, we want to help people go from, the design through tooling and actually getting into production vastly more rapidly. And the idea behind that is that you need tradespeople, right, to take your design and go through that mystical, arcane process to come up with the tool.
Yep.
And then ultimately reach production. So if we can make that, 1 or 2 orders of magnitude faster, you can literally accelerate all manufacturing across many different domains. I mean, there are plastic parts, right? But you can also apply a lot of this stuff to different areas of manufacturing that use tool and die making, which would be, right, like high pressure die casting for aluminum components. You've seen like the gigacast, right, in a Tesla factory.
Yeah.
So that's die casting basically. And then stamping, like sheet metal stamping out parts for cars or airplanes and things like that. Forging is another one, right? There's Cleveland has like one of the largest stamping presses in the world here that does, wing structures for the F-35s made out of like titanium. It's crazy.
Yeah.
But you need like an engineered die to do that with. And so I think we can vastly, accelerate manufacturing processes. And so that's kind of how we see ourselves, as improving the speed of going from design to production, basically.
On the talent piece, I think we've kind of loosely outlined, there's a generational challenge that we're about to face where this, traditional knowledge embedded within, people's experience and heads won't translate to the next generation. on top of the fact that, we haven't tapped into this latent desire people maybe have to build things with their hands, although it's there, but the younger generation is not going into manufacturing. How do you address this?
Yeah, I mean, so this is kind of the idea behind really trying to drive incentives in this direction.
Yeah.
So you have, Tesla and SpaceX and this big movement happening in like aerospace and defense, right? Where people can see this stuff happening on a regular basis. I mean, I don't even know how many Falcon launches there have been. I think like almost 100.
Yeah.
96 or something like that. It's crazy.
It's a lot.
It just become like the hedonic treadmill, right? It just becomes regular all of a sudden. And you're like, we're actually reusing and landing rockets now.
It's very
like,
cool.
All the time. I think that is just human nature, honestly. But more and more people are getting psyched about that kind of stuff, right? And I think startup companies, technology companies are very interesting, like purpose-built vehicles that are made to scale around like a single problem. And so what I'm excited about, at least, is seeing more companies enter into this space. We obviously need to prove that they are scalable and like get them to these states where they can become very large tech companies, right?
Yep.
And attract more people, more resources, more talent into them. And this, like the whole idea, I think, is that, the Overton window is very squarely, positioned over this right now.
Yes.
Where not only like policy can be reshifted and reoriented to support stuff like this, but a lot of capital in the world is looking at this space right now. So honestly, the stars are very aligned, right? In a lot of ways to not only like see all of the hype and like the real things that are happening in manufacturing going on right now, but to actually incentivize people to move back into this field. And, one company is great, but we need more. And so I'm hoping as more entrepreneurs and founders jump into the fight, there's so many problems to solve, honestly. Yeah. I don't want to say that startup companies are kind of like, the last bastion of hope, but I think that they can be the vanguard for it, right? Like leading the charge in this stuff. Yep. And I don't want to keep going back to Elon's companies, but it's like he's really doing that in a lot of ways, whether you love him or hate him, right? Like he's out there building gigafactories literally like all over the world and being able to demonstrate the reduction in like the footprint of these factories while improving their efficiencies, right? Yep. As time goes on.
The ephemeralization, doing more with less.
Yeah. I mean, like, and that's honestly some of the highest level examples of this that we have today. But I think that's possible in so many different areas. So it's, yeah, I think, we want to move in a direction where maybe you can make as much working in a factory, like a future factory, as you could at Netflix, and maybe it wouldn't be some like garbage union job.
Right.
It might actually be like a cool, more tech-oriented job where you get equity and you can get rich working, like this would be new wave industrialism, basically.
Right. And with that, the prestige and, as a respected path.
Yeah.
As you made this transition yourself, and ultimately, I think in an attempt trying to recruit others to do the same, what did you find in reflection were the most transferable things you learned at Remesh, from this world of bits and software that apply and you can leverage with Atomic? And where does that, transferability stop and how do you address that delta?
Well, yeah, I think one of the most fascinating things with at least my, my mutt pedigree, if you want to think about it like that, like my path, is how much of the culture of Silicon Valley and like technology I've scooped up.
Yeah.
And, you obviously just get to like make your own culture ultimately, but rebuilding the culture of manufacturing with that is pretty fascinating. I think in a lot of ways, some of my peers that came before Atomic, right? Like that was a classic interaction that broke down and failed in a lot of ways. Like getting, some of the best machinists in the world to work at a tech company. They're like, what the hell is this? Like what's Trello? Or I don't know, like, why do I have to have a laptop and like, a phone and use Gmail, and like, why are you trying to text me on Saturday? There's like, and don't get me wrong, like people in manufacturing, like they grind really hard. It's just they're different worlds colliding. So I think it's really fascinating to get them overlapping and aligned. And a big part of that is really building something that in a lot of ways like converts them into believers in technology. It's not that they don't care about it or anything, right? It's like if you try to do what we're doing like 10 years ago, even a lot of people in manufacturing probably would have just laughed you out of a room or not taken it really very seriously at all.
Right.
And that literal cultural barrier has held back tech and manufacturing for a long time, because a lot of people probably just assume that, people from tech are just trying to build like a dashboard or a piece of software that's trying to make some other aspect of the manufacturing process like more efficient. When in reality, they're really just like, all they care about is when they start cutting steel.
Right. To me, it's really fascinating because to your point about the Overton window, like I think there's a reason it's within it now, because there's this confluence of all the macro things we're talking about so far that it's like, well, the common criticism of Silicon Valley is like, well, what has it done to actually improve my life? I mean, we're at a point now where we're talking about banning social media overall, and we face this, wake of what happened throughout the pandemic. And I think there's a recognition that we have to actually, maybe do something about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of people are kind of waking up to that idea, and it's, like the market and the timing of the downturn, right, are also really fascinating when you're talking about stuff like this, because I think people look at that and they're like, wow, maybe the party's over now. I don't know. I mean, we had a crazy bull run for a long time, and a lot of people make fun of, this like ZERP era of companies that just popped into being, basically,
right,
with hardly any oversight at all. And some of it's highly questionable, right?
But inherent in what you're doing, and at least the vision you've painted, is optimism.
I would say so, yeah. And real world value.
Yes.
Like it directly translates to making the real world, more positive in a lot of ways. So it's not that I'm, if you make manufacturing more efficient and like higher throughput or whatever, does that translate to just making more garbage, I guess, in the world? Or no, right? Like there's a real need for physical goods, as we know. And I think that you will have, it's all very cyclical, right? Like if you look at how manufacturing works, there's the supply and demand levels always fluctuate. The steady state of demand for any good is, questionable, I think. But one thing is pretty certain, though, is that manufacturers want to have more flexibility and agility when they make something. So, yeah, ultimately, having that real world impact and very tangible value chain, I think, is just more meaningful, honestly. Maybe ultimately AI will just literally automate away the business layer, right? And SaaS companies can just kind of be this automated function, and that would be great. But ultimately, this is where post-industrial society really goes, right? It's
right.
Like you want to think about like the worlds of Blade Runner and Star Wars, right? Like, yeah, people are using computers and terminals and things, but there's also like cities are mega scale, and you've got, starships and things like colonizing other worlds and stuff. Like, how do you get there from where we are, right? It's industrialism. It's not more software, basically, even though you still need software to guide a lot of these processes. So that's kind of, I know that's a giant leap, but yeah, I think it really takes, the ultimate successful marriage of technology and manufacturing to get to something like that.
Yeah. Well, I think you've alluded to what I want to ask about next from this perspective of, avoiding end of life regrets. But what does success mean to you in the context of all of this?
I mean, ultimately, in a real quantitative way, it's just demonstrating, the optimization of this manufacturing process that we're doing. So
yeah,
if we can prove, very scalable unit economics and being able to refine and improve them over time, just very analogous to like Tesla's model, I think that's a win, right? And if you can do that across other areas of manufacturing, that's huge. And that all adds up into this like idea of exascaling, basically. And we need it in every different area, right? I could list off 1,000 different things right now that I would love to see that happen in. But yeah, for us, that's at the end of the day, being able to prove out what we started, right? I mean, like, that's it.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. Well, I'll ask then, why have you opted to, I think, be more public with the thesis, itself and the vision more generally for techno-industrial optimism? Why write a manifesto?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to at least have a framework. And I'm not like deeming my framework as the framework, but I think it's a good start to one, at least.
Yeah.
That's my idea of kind of like open sourcing something, right? Just put it out there.
Right. And get the feedback of the public.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, it's super challenging too to think about what improving the industrial base even means, because it's so vast and, ubiquitous in a lot of ways. So having a framework with potentially even like a roadmap is something that, is super valuable to people trying to work on this stuff. And I discovered the problem by just running into a brick wall, with my face.
How do I make this figurine?
Yeah, pretty much. And I think there's a ton of really driven people looking for stuff right now, in this world. And I think as more incentives open up, especially if more funding comes down the pipeline for, reindustrialization, there will need to be, I really don't want to say this, but I think there has to be a little bit of like thought leadership. I really don't want to say that phrase ever around this stuff. I mean, like, I'm just out there building one of these companies right now, and this is kind of the internal model that I came up with for it. And so, I mean, I talk to people all the time about, what they could potentially go into and work on. Maybe next should be like a tech tree or like a roadmap or something of areas that people could attack.
Yeah, I like that. What is Monozukuri?
Oh, well, so this is it's a really interesting Japanese principle, like to their culture and society, which is, it really just boils down to the idea of like knowing how to make something is key to like their success, basically. And they celebrate it. It's kind of like an internalized nationalistic principle, basically, like being able to make a certain thing, right? And like the knowledge wrapped around that is something they hold very like highly.
Yeah.
And it's not something that we hold highly.
Not at the moment.
And like I don't think that, the American industrial base is like about to explode. We're still like number 2 in the world, right? We're overall kind of all over the place in terms of how we rank in terms of, GDP per capita, in terms of like value add in manufacturing compared to the top like 20 countries that do this stuff. Because some really small countries are obviously like way more productive and have higher output per capita. But that idea it's fascinating.
It is fascinating.
And we like, I want us to be able to internalize something very similar, right? And that's kind of like the idea of we're losing touch with the physical world, and we need to kind of like rein it in. And we have an amazing opportunity to do that using technology. So it could be some kind of like cybernetic Monozukuri, right? Where it's like we basically teach machines how to do a lot of this stuff, but at the same time, we regain a lot of that, trade knowledge and preserve it basically like with machines, which is fascinating in its own self. But
yeah. Well, there's still so many things I could ask you about. I want to ask though, is there something particularly important that we haven't talked about, in your analysis of what you're working on at Atomic, the kind of more macro level thing that you would want to introduce here or call attention to?
Yeah, I think like something I think about a lot too is just the policy side of this.
Yeah.
And it is generally something that is quite unique in its ability to be bipartisan in nature. Like, pretty sure everybody agrees that we should have more capability stateside and domestically, and that the security of the industrial base is obviously like very important.
Yeah.
Especially in the face of, potential global conflict or destabilization. I mean, the trend of deglobalization right now is fascinating, right? And I think you'd find people that would argue different sides of that itself. But overall, I think it's accepted that we're kind of moving in that direction. And that's one of those like macro forcing functions. And ultimately, the policy around it, which I think there's two very distinct angles. One is basically we need to make more stuff in America, right?
Yeah.
I have a great company or idea kind of like at that application layer, right? I want to make a new drug or a drone or whatever it is. Like, are the incentives there for me to spin up a factory and start producing more stuff?
Yeah.
A lot of times from the capital risk perspective, the ROI is very questionable, right? Like on paying for somebody's factory. So having the ability to spin up more like physical capacity is a big component of that when you are kind of sitting and waiting at the application layer, like to scale.
Yeah.
That also calls into question whether or not there are enough people once I build the factory, right, to work in it and help me make more of these things that I want to make.
Right.
A la like semiconductors, right?
Right.
Like
to your point about Intel.
Yeah. So that's a fascinating conundrum, but you still need, you need to either train people really quickly or accelerate how they're trained. So if you can somehow condense trade knowledge and go from like a 10-year time span to a 1-year time span, right? Like that's massive. How do you do that? Is that something that, do we use like these LLMs or some type of AI to regurgitate or kind of like to be an aid for you to like learn faster? I mean, we have a natural learning rate as humans, right? So you can only make that go so fast.
Yeah.
And you want to make sure that to get off the ground, right? Like that escape velocity for trade, whatever trade it is, you can short circuit it somehow through like any kind of technology. So there's a ton of really fascinating ideas there. And the other side of this is that, yeah, we know that machines are expensive, right? And factories are not generally the greatest investments. And it's hard, right, to make good margins on CapEx heavy businesses. So what about like the other side of this, which is how do we actually improve the factory, right? Like maybe it doesn't have to be that bad. There's a natural physical limit, right, to how much machines actually cost and what their throughputs are and energy and all these other real world, problems when you put it together. But we don't really focus on that either, right? Like this is why the optimization of different things in manufacturing is fascinating, because you can, you can make them better and you can make them more scalable. And this is why I like the analogy of AWS, right? When Amazon first came out with that, there was basically an explosion of software companies because now they could just build on top of, Amazon. They took away all the complexity of like setting up your own servers and all that stuff. And I really think that we can do that for the physical world in a lot of ways. I don't know. You've probably seen what what like AWS dashboard looks like and how many services they offer. It's really crazy.
It's a lot.
Yeah, there's literally
a lot of
hundreds of things that AWS does for a company, and like it's very similar in manufacturing. So it's this real hairy problem, but over time, that's kind of what we need to do. We need to AWS-ify the industrial base.
Right. I mean, it's to such a degree that, I mean, one of the best framings of AWS that I've heard is it's basically a tax on software and the internet at this point.
Basically, yeah.
But arguably a productive one.
Yeah. Well, right. I mean, that's why, Sam Altman and other people think like pretty soon you'll see companies that only need like two or three people, and they're just billion-dollar companies that are pure software, right? Can we get to that kind of level with physical hardware companies or manufacturing companies, right? Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of bad capital allocation that could be redirected into stuff like this, right? That just has so much more value, ultimately. And these types of companies are, I think the other problem too is there's not enough sophistication around how these things play out, because this is really a frontier, a very new frontier, and we don't have many good, comps on companies doing stuff like this. So it's hard to compare like what a multiple would be on, a true like cybernetic manufacturing company, if you want to think about it like that.
Yeah. But man, it's exciting.
It is. Yeah. I mean, it's up to
so
us.
Compelling as well.
Yeah. We really have to prove it out. So who knows? I think there's a really interesting frontier out there to be explored.
Yeah. Well, what an opportunity. I mean, it really is fascinating to think about. Well, I think we can work to bookend the conversation here. I'll leave a little space if you have any, parting thoughts, and then I can ask our traditional closing question.
Yeah, I think just a little bit more on the policy side, because my brain kind of locked onto that a little bit. But these two distinct sides of, like, how do we use technology to improve manufacturing? And also, we need more manufacturing, right?
Yes.
I just think it's important that if moving forward, we do think that these things are existential threats or, areas for policy improvement, that we really take a look at areas in the country, at least geographically, that are going to be more, I guess, supportive, or I guess it is kind of like a form of support for this, but like you really want to find areas to rebuild the industrial base, right? Like obviously the Midwest has great DNA for that. From a policy perspective, is it really the best place, right? So if you get one of these companies off the ground and it hits unicorn, decacorn kind of, status, are the unions going to come like crushing down on it like a big three automaker, right? Like there's a reason Tesla doesn't have a factory up here. This is the kind of stuff where it's very, very, culturally combative, I think, and potentially harmful.
Yeah.
For something like this to really flourish here. I don't know, but I genuinely hope that we can like explore that and move beyond it if it is.
Well, I share that hope and desire.
I just don't want ourselves to shoot ourselves in the foot. That's all. Because there's like a massive, massive opportunity for it.
Right. But it does require overcoming short-termism. Like you have to, we would have to collectively invest for the long term.
A big investment. Yeah. And also just get over those kinds of like cultural humps that I think keep Silicon Valley culture and thinking from merging with, this old world, salt of the earth kind of Midwestern mentality, which is also great. But if they can't work together, it's going to be, probably just have to go to Texas or something.
Right. But, it's worth saying out loud, because practically, right, that's what's happening.
Yes. And it's really like, to me, it would just be a total shame, right? Because this really is like the most fertile ground to do this.
Right.
And
I mean, hearkening back to that history piece, I mean, there was a point in time where it was like literally half of the world's stuff came from this area.
Yeah. And the Midwest was basically, between Ohio and Michigan the highest salaries per capita in the country were here.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying we can make that happen again overnight, but potentially, in the future, that could be a reality. Yeah, it's fascinating.
It is. Well, with that, I'll ask you about Cleveland. And, well, the traditional closing question is for a hidden gem, for something that folks may not know about that perhaps they should.
I think this is something that popped into my head the other day, and I tweeted about it a little bit. But in storytelling, I think that there's a fascinating, endless refinement kind of property to storytelling that, genuinely, I don't care who you are. Everybody's pitch or story can be improved, and you will find ways to do that. I always find myself thinking about, how I said something and being like, wow, that's actually, I should just do that. And I know this is probably not a really interesting realization for a lot of people, or maybe it is, I don't know. But I think telling these stories can be very tiring, right? Repitching the same thing over and over and over again, but
which is almost the nature of the job.
It is a lot of the job is doing this. And maybe that's why it's this little nugget of wisdom, I guess. But I think, discovering that in, the stories that you tell, or even that you pick up over time, over and over again, is a really fascinating property, and something that I don't necessarily pride myself on that, but I just find myself doing it almost just through osmosis, I guess, of doing this over and over and over and over again. But, I would say that that's kind of my weird little nugget, is that having this repeatable, endlessly refinable process of storytelling is incredibly valuable for some reason. And I think it's not everybody needs to tell stories all the time, but it's cool. But
it's certainly requisite for founders.
Sure. Yeah. I would highly recommend anybody, trying to get out there and do this stuff to seek that out, basically, in their own storytelling.
And what about Cleveland?
I have so many high hopes. The reason I wanted to throw in the storytelling thing is that after going over this so many times now, right?
Yeah.
I really always, and this might just come back to me being a masochist, I guess. I don't know. I really don't know. I look at this place and I genuinely see, empire building kind of potential. And I want that for here. I think ultimately, some kind of grand opportunity or vision has to collectively be bought in, right?
Yep.
And again, this is just why I think this story is so fascinating, because it is our DNA. And if there were ever a time to do this, it would be
now,
in the near term future, right?
Yeah.
If not just right now. And so, my hopes and dreams for this place really kind of squarely rest on the reindustrialization efforts of the United States. And I think it's just honestly the most perfect place to do it.
I share that sentiment wholeheartedly. If the hidden gem of Cleveland is the latent potential that we can tap into right now, that's pretty good.
I think that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I appreciate that sentiment very much. Wow. Fascinating stuff. This was awesome, Aaron. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Good to ultimately do this, and hopefully it's not the last one either.
I hope not. Yeah. Well, wow. If folks had anything they wanted to follow up with you about, what would be, where can they find you on X, Twitter? Where's the best place?
Yeah. X/Twitter is good. That's probably the best place, actually.
Yeah. What's your handle?
A physicist, all one word.
Perfect.
Sweet.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you, sir.
That's all for this week. Thank you for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show. So if you have any feedback, please send over an email to jeffrey@layoftheland.fm, or find us on Twitter @podlayoftheland or @sternhefe, JEFE. If you or someone you know would make a good guest for our show, please reach out as well and let us know. And if you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or on your preferred podcast player. Your support goes a long way to help us spread the word and continue to bring the Cleveland founders and builders we love having on the show. We'll be back here next week at the same time to map more of the land. The Lay of the Land podcast was developed in collaboration with the Up Company LLC. At the time of this recording, unless otherwise indicated, we do not own equity or other financial interests in the company which appear on this show. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of any entity which employs us. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.